The day Mamie Ford walked into the bounty office in Laredo, Texas, she was wearing a dress that had been mended so many times the original color was almost impossible to determine. Her boots were held together at the left toe with a strip of rawhide, and she was carrying the name of the man who had sold her like it was a loaded pistol she'd been waiting years to fire. It was the spring of 1878, and the air in Laredo smelled of river mud and horses, and the particular kind of dust that never quite settled, the kind that got into your lungs and stayed there like a memory of everywhere you had never meant to go. The town was alive in the late morning, merchants sweeping their stoops, women in sun-faded bonnets moving between the general store and the milliner, cowboys drifting in from the surrounding ranchlands with cash in their pockets and intention in their eyes. Mamie paid none of them any mind. She had one purpose, and it had been driving her forward for 8 months across 3 territories, and more hardship than most men she'd ever met would have survived a week of. She pushed open the door to the bounty office without knocking, because she had learned long ago that women who knock on doors in this world get turned away at them, but women who walk through them sometimes get heard. The office was small and cluttered in the way of working spaces that are actually used. Wanted posters covered one full wall, overlapping at their edges, some of them so old the paper had gone the color of tobacco. A rifle rack held 3 guns, all clean. A scarred wooden desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat a man who did not look up immediately when she entered, because he was reading something with the focused attention of someone who took the written word seriously. He was somewhere around 30 years of age, lean in the way of men who spend more time riding than eating, with dark brown hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that was shadowed with several days of beard. He wore a plain work shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that had seen considerable use. The badge on his vest read Deputy U.S. Marshal, but the other items on his desk, the stacks of wanted posters, the logbook thick with names and descriptions, the small locked strongbox in the corner, told a fuller story. This was a man who worked the bounty system with the diligence of someone who believed in its purpose. He looked up. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of a sky in the hour before rain, and they assessed her in the way of someone trained to read people quickly and without sentiment, though there was nothing cold in the assessment. It was simply careful. "Can I help you?" he said. "I am looking for the bounty hunter," Mamie said, "or the marshal, whoever is in charge of wanted men in this county." "That would be me," he said, setting down his papers. "Clement Wells, what can I do for you?" Mamie Ford stood up straighter, though she was already standing straight, had been holding herself that way for years because it was one of the only things no one could take from you, the angle of your own spine. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from much handling. "I want to turn in a man," she said. "His name is Harold Finch. He operates out of the Texas Panhandle and into New Mexico territory. He sells people." She set the paper on his desk. "Women mostly, sometimes men who have nowhere to run. He runs it like a business, keeps ledgers and everything. He sold me 3 years ago to a man in Abilene, and before that he sold 2 other women I knew by name, and before that there were more whose names I never learned." Clement Wells did not react with the dismissiveness she had learned to expect. He did not look at her with that particular expression of polite disbelief that powerful men wore when women brought them inconvenient truths. He leaned forward, placed both forearms on the desk, and said, "Sit down, please." She sat. He unfolded the paper she had given him with the same careful attention he had given his reading when she walked in. The paper held a hand-drawn map, several names, and a list of dates and locations written in a small, precise hand. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "I did. Where did you get the information?" "From 8 months of traveling, asking questions, and finding the women who were still alive to give me answers, and from my own memory, which is very good." He looked at her across the desk with those gray eyes, and she met his gaze without flinching, because she had not come this far to flinch at a man's scrutiny. Harold Finch, he said, and the way he said it was different from the way she had expected. There was a recognition in it, not surprise, something older and more settled. I have been looking for Harold Finch for 4 years. Mamie felt something shift in her chest. She had hoped for someone who would listen. She had not quite allowed herself to hope for someone who already knew. Then you know what he is, she said. I know some of what he is, Clement said. I have never been able to get enough evidence to hold him. Every time I have gotten close, the witnesses disappear or recant. He has money and he knows how to use it. He looked at the paper again. But what you have here is testimony, she said. 9 women, I have written statements from 7 of them signed and witnessed, and I am the 10th witness myself. Clement Wells set the paper down very carefully as if it were something of great value, which it was. Miss, he said, and then stopped. What is your name? Mamie Ford. Miss Ford, he said, I need you to understand something before we go any further. What you have done in gathering this information is extraordinary. It is also dangerous. If Harold Finch discovers that these women have spoken, or that you have brought this to a federal officer, the danger to all of you increases significantly. I know, Mamie said. I have been living with danger for 3 years, Mr. Wells. I have become somewhat accustomed to it. Something crossed his face then, something that was not quite admiration and not quite sorrow but lived in the territory between them. He nodded once slowly. All right, he said. Tell me everything. So she did. She had been born in Georgia in 1854, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who died when Mamie was 11. She had come west in 1873 with her father and her older sister, Clara, following the promise of land in the Texas Panhandle after her father received a letter from a cousin who had made a go of cattle ranching. The cousin's letter had been somewhat optimistic in its description of conditions. The land was hard and the work was harder, and then her father had died in the winter of 1874, and then Clara had married a man who was decent enough but who had his own family to feed. And Mamie, 20 years old and alone in the world in the particular way that young women without male relatives were alone in 1874, had taken work where she could find it. Harold Finch had presented himself as an employment agent. He had a proper office in Amarillo, with a painted sign and a printed ledger, and a manner of great professional reassurance. He offered to connect young women of good character with respectable employment in households and businesses across the territory. He charged nothing up front. He seemed entirely legitimate. He had sold her to a man named Douglas Crane who ran a saloon in Abilene, Kansas. Not as a saloon girl, which was its own kind of complicated story with its own set of injustices, but in a more comprehensive and horrifying arrangement that Mamie described to Clement in plain words, because she had decided long ago that she would not soften what had been done to her in order to make it easier for someone else to hear. Clement Wells listened without interrupting and without looking away from her face. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady. She had escaped from Douglas Crane's establishment after 14 months, with the help of a woman named Ruth Caldwell, who had been there longer and knew which of the hired men would look the other way for the right amount of money. She had taken nothing with her but the clothes on her back and the absolute certainty that she was going to find Harold Finch. She had spent 8 months doing exactly that. When she finished speaking, the office was quiet for a moment except for the sounds of Laredo continuing its mourning outside the window. Miss Ford, Clement said, I want to be honest with you about what comes next. Please, she said. If we move on Finch now with what you have, I believe we can get an arrest. Possibly a conviction, though that is harder in territories like this, where judges know people and money talks. But I want to try very much. He paused. But I cannot guarantee your safety in the process. He will know someone talked. He will likely know it was you. I know, she said. You are not afraid. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. I am afraid every day, she said. But I am more tired of being afraid than I am afraid of what happens if I stop letting fear make my decisions. Clement Wells looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something she had not expected. He said, Where are you staying tonight? She had not, in fact, thought that far ahead. She had been so focused on getting here, on completing this single objective, that the question of what came after had remained abstract. I have a little money left, she said carefully. There is a boarding house on Cal del Norte, run by a woman named Mrs. Esperanza Reyes, who is honest and keeps a clean house and does not ask too many questions, Clement said. I will send word ahead if you like. Tell her you are a friend of mine. Why would you do that? Mamie asked, not suspiciously but genuinely curious. Because you just handed me 4 years of work, he said simply. And because whatever happened to you was wrong and someone should have said so a long time ago. Mamie Ford, who had not cried in 8 months because crying required the kind of safety she had not had, felt something loosen in her chest that she could not quite name. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Thank you, she said. Clement stood, and she realized that he was taller than she had gauged from across the desk, with the kind of proportionate build that suggested he had grown up doing physical work. He took his hat from the hook by the door, a plain brown hat with a straight brim, and held the door open for her. I will come by Mrs. Reyes's place this evening, he said. I would like to go over your notes more carefully, with your permission. Of course, she said. She walked out into the Laredo morning, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something that might have been the distant cousin of hope. Mrs. Esperanza Reyes was a woman of about 50 with silver hair and dark eyes, and a manner that combined warmth with absolute efficiency, the way of women who have managed households and people for decades. She gave Mamie a room on the second floor with a window that overlooked a small courtyard where a fig tree grew, and she brought up a pitcher of hot water and a plate of tortillas and beans without being asked, and she said, You look like you have been traveling a long time. Yes, Mamie said. Rest, Mrs. Reyes said. Whatever it is, it will still be there after you have slept. Mamie slept for the first time in weeks without one ear listening for trouble. Clement came that evening as he had said he would, hat in hand, with the paper she had given him and several additional sheets on which he had been making notes throughout the day. Mrs. Reyes brought them coffee in the small sitting room off the entrance hall, and left them to their business with the tact of someone who understood that serious matters required space. They worked for 3 hours. Clement spread his information out alongside Mamie's, and the picture that emerged was damning. Finch had been operating for at least 7 years. The women Mamie had tracked down accounted for only a fraction of those he had sold. The destinations ranged from saloons and gaming houses to the households of wealthy men across 4 territories. He had contacts in local law enforcement in at least 2 towns, which was why previous attempts to build cases against him had collapsed. His protection is his money and the fact that the people he harms are not considered reliable witnesses in most courts, Clement said, and his voice was flat with something that was not resignation but was close to controlled anger. Women without families, women without resources, women who have been through what you have been through. Defense lawyers take them apart on the stand. I am aware, Mamie said dryly. He looked at her. But you will not be taken apart, he said, and it was not a question. I will not, she agreed. I believe you, he said, and again she had the sensation of being genuinely seen by someone, which was rarer and more disorienting than it should have been. They worked on, and somewhere in the second hour she noticed that he had a habit of running his thumb along his jaw when he was thinking, a small unconscious gesture, and that he listened to her as an equal, built on her ideas rather than talking over them, and asked her opinion on matters of strategy as if it were a natural thing to do, which it was, but which very few men she had encountered seemed to understand. When they had done what they could for the evening, he gathered his notes and stood, and she walked him to the door of the boarding house. I will send a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in San Antonio tomorrow morning, he said. We will need authorization to move into Panhandle territory. That may take a week, possibly 2. All right, she said. In the meantime, he said, and he seemed to choose his next words with a care that was visible, I would ask that you stay close to town, not as a restriction, Only because if Finch has any way of knowing you are here and what you have brought, I would prefer to know where you are. You would prefer to keep me safe, she said, not unkindly. Yes, he said, if you will permit it. She looked at him in the soft light that came from Mrs. Ray's oil lamp in the hallway behind her, this careful, serious man who had spent 4 years trying to bring justice to a predator that most of the world ignored, and she said, "Good night, Mr. Wells." "Good night, Miss Ford," he said, and put on his hat and walked out into the Laredo night. Over the following days, a kind of rhythm established itself that Mamie had not expected and found she was not inclined to resist. Clement came every evening, and they worked, and they talked, and the talking gradually extended beyond the business at hand into something wider and less defined. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, come west at 19 with a brother who had subsequently died of a fever in the 2nd year, and stayed because going back seemed like moving in the wrong direction. He had taken work as a deputy in a small county in West Texas, discovered that he was good at tracking people and better at reading evidence, and had eventually earned his federal appointment through a combination of skill and the dogged accumulation of a reputation for honesty that was, in the world of 1870s Western law enforcement, less common than it should have been. He learned that she had been a good student, that her father had insisted on education with the fervor of a man who knew its value, that she could read Latin and do mathematics in her head, and had once, in another life, planned to be a teacher, that she had a sense of humor that she deployed carefully and with excellent timing, that she had strong opinions about most things and was perfectly willing to share them, and that she had not, in 8 months of solo travel through sometimes dangerous country, asked anyone for help that she did not genuinely need. "How did you travel?" he asked her one evening. 8 months across 3 territories on your own." "On horseback mostly," she said. "I bought a horse in Abilene, a gray mare named Dolers. She is at the livery stable on the south end of town." "You named your horse?" "Of course I named her. She was my only company for most of the journey." Something in his expression shifted, a small softening that he did not seem entirely aware of. "Was she good company?" "Excellent," Mamie said seriously. "She never told me I was wrong, and she always kept moving, which is more than I can say for most people." He laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, the kind that surprised him, and Mamie felt the warmth of it in a way that was new and slightly alarming in its pleasantness. She went to see Dolers every morning, bringing the mare pieces of apple from the general store, and it was on one of these morning visits that she first noticed the man. He was standing on the opposite side of the main street, leaning against the wall of the feed store with the careful casualness of someone trying to look as though they were not watching anything. He was wearing a canvas jacket despite the spring warmth, and his hat was pulled low. When she looked at him directly, he moved off in the unhurried manner of someone who had been waiting for a signal to leave. She did not run to Clement's office. She completed her visit to Dolers, bought the things she needed at the general store, and returned to Mrs. Ray's boarding house, where she sat at the small writing desk in her room and thought carefully about what she had seen and what it might mean. That evening she told Clement. His expression did not change dramatically, but something went very still in his eyes in the way of a man recalibrating information. "Describe him," he said. She did. She was good at description. Her father had taught her to observe, and her 8 months of travel had sharpened the skill. Clement nodded slowly. "I do not know that specific man, but the behavior is consistent with someone hired to watch rather than act, which means someone is gathering information, not yet ready to move." "Finch knows I am here," she said, "or suspects it," he said. "The question is how quickly he will decide to do something about it." "How quickly can you get authorization from San Antonio?" "I sent a second telegraph this morning," he said. "I explained the urgency. We may have an answer within the week." He leaned forward. "Mamie." He had stopped saying Miss Ford several days ago, a transition that had happened naturally and that neither of them had commented on. "I think it might be wise to move you somewhere less visible while we wait." "Where?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I have a property," he said. About 12 miles north of town in the hills. It was my brother's originally. I have been maintaining it. It is remote enough that unexpected visitors tend to announce themselves by the time they reach the yard, and I know the land well." He paused. "I am not suggesting anything improper. There is a main house and a separate smaller structure that serves as a bunkhouse. You would have privacy and safety. And I would ask Mrs. Reyes if she would be willing to come as well, as a companion, if that would make the arrangement more comfortable." Mamie considered him. In another life, in another kind of story, a man offering to move her to his remote property would be precisely the kind of thing she had learned to be wary of. But she had been reading Clement Wells for 10 days now, and she was a good reader of people, and what she read in him was exactly what he showed, which was itself unusual enough to be significant. "Ask Mrs. Reyes," she said. "If she is willing, then yes." Mrs. Reyes was willing. "I have a nephew who can manage the boarding house for a week," she said practically, "and I have not been to the hills in too long." They moved the following morning early, before the town was fully awake. Clement rode a dark bay horse that moved with the smooth efficiency of an animal well trained and well cared for. Mamie rode Dolors, who was glad to be out of the livery, and expressed this with a lively step. Mrs. Reyes drove a small wagon with their things and a supply of provisions, and she sang to herself softly in Spanish for most of the journey, which made the morning feel safer than it had any right to. The property was exactly as Clement had described it. A main house of rough limestone, solid and plain, with a covered porch that faced east and a view of the hill country that in the spring morning light was genuinely beautiful in the spare, exact way of the Texas landscape. The bunkhouse stood 30 feet to the south, and a kitchen garden at the back of the main house showed signs of being tended, though not recently. Mamie stood in the yard and looked at the hills and breathed air that smelled of cedar and limestone and the faint sweetness of wildflowers growing along the creek bed below. And for a moment she was simply a woman standing in a beautiful place, without history or urgency, just alive in the world. "My brother planted the cedar along the north fence," Clement said from behind her, and his voice was quiet. "He said it would eventually provide good shade. He was right about that. He was right about most practical things." She turned to look at him. "What was his name?" "Samuel," he said. "Sam." "I am sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said, and it was one of those exchanges between people who understand that some things cannot be added to, and they stood for a moment in the shared and simple weight of loss before Mrs. Reyes called from the house that she had found the kitchen and had opinions about the state of the coffee supply. The week that followed was, in some ways, the strangest of Mamie's life, because it was the first time in 3 years that she had lived without immediate threat, in a place that felt like a place rather than a position, and she found herself unsure of what to do with the sensation. She read, borrowing from the small but serious collection of books Clement kept on a shelf by the fireplace. She helped Mrs. Reyes in the kitchen, and discovered that Mrs. Reyes was teaching her to cook in a way that made Mamie's previous attempts at the skill look like optimistic guesswork. She walked in the evenings along the creek bed and looked at the hills turning pink and gold in the setting light. And Clement was there. He rode into Laredo and back each day to check for telegraphs and manage his other responsibilities, and he returned each evening, and each evening they talked. They talked about everything, about law and its failures and its possibilities, about what justice meant in a country that was still trying to figure out who it owed anything to and mostly coming up with the wrong answers, about books, and about the specific kind of beauty that existed in the Texas hill country in spring, about her father and his brother, and the particular shape of grief that was not acute, but was instead a permanent alteration of the landscape of the self. On the 5th evening, they were sitting on the porch after dinner, the hills dark against a sky still holding the last of the light in the west, and the conversation had paused in the easy way of people who are comfortable enough with each other to let silence exist between them. "Why this work?" she asked. "You could have done other things. You are clearly capable of other things." He was quiet for a moment, elbows on his knees, looking out at the darkening hills. "There was a woman in the county where I worked my first deputy job," he said. "Her husband was a man of standing, or what passed for it in that county. He had done things to her and to her children that were not talked about, because the community had decided that what happened in a man's household was not anyone else's business." He paused. "She came to me, and I could not do anything, not legally, not in any way that would hold. She went back to him because she had nowhere else to go, and 3 months later she was dead." The night was very quiet around them. "Her name was Margaret Holloway," he said. "She was 26 years old." Mamie said nothing for a moment. Then, "So you try to build the cases that hold." "I try to make it so that the next woman who comes forward has something to stand on," he said. "I do not always manage it, but I keep trying." She looked at his profile in the last of the light, this man who had turned a tragedy into purpose and had carried it quietly and without performance. And she felt something she had not felt in a long time, the particular vulnerability of beginning to care about someone, of allowing them to become real to you in a way that meant their well-being mattered to your own. It was, she thought, somewhat inconvenient timing. But then, she had never been able to control her own timing very well. On the 7th day, the telegraph came. Clement rode back from Laredo in the early afternoon, faster than his usual pace, and she knew from the way he dismounted that it was news. "Authorization granted," he said. "Federal backing, 2 additional deputies from San Antonio who will meet us in a town called Vega, near the Panhandle. They have also been doing some quiet work on Finch's movements, and they believe he is currently at his main base of operations, a ranch property about 30 miles east of Amarillo." Mamie stood in the yard with the sun on her face and felt the weight of 3 years realigning itself. "When do we leave?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. And then, carefully, "You do not have to come. Your testimony can be submitted in written form. The statements you gathered from the other women are enough, combined with what my office has. You have done the work. You could stay here, stay safe, and let the law complete what you started." She looked at him steadily. "I did not travel 8 months across 3 territories to watch from a hill while someone else finished it." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, "I thought you would say that. I still needed to ask." "I know," she said. "I appreciate that you did." They left the next morning, all 3 of them, though Mrs. Reyes turned south toward Laredo rather than north, kissing Mamie on both cheeks and pressing a wrapped parcel of food into her hands, and telling Clement in Spanish that he should take care of this woman, or she would know the reason why. Clement replied in Spanish that appeared to genuinely surprise Mrs. Reyes by its fluency, and whatever he said made her laugh and then look at Mamie with an expression of warm approval. "What did you say to her?" Mamie asked when they were on the road north. "I told her I intended to," he said simply, and did not elaborate, and Mamie looked at the road ahead and let herself feel the warmth of that without pulling at it. The ride north took 3 days. They stayed at small waystation hotels and once at a ranch belonging to a family Clement knew, where they were given a hot supper and clean beds, and sent off the next morning with fresh water in their canteens. The landscape changed as they moved north, the hill country giving way to the broader, flatter terrain of the high plains, the cedar and live oak thinning out, and then giving up entirely to the enormous, level horizon of the Panhandle, a kind of landscape that Mamie had learned was an acquired taste, but which she had come to respect for its absolute honesty. There was nowhere to hide in the Panhandle. The land showed you exactly what it was. She thought, not for the first time, that there was a metaphor in that. They met the San Antonio deputies in Vega, a small and windswept settlement that seemed mostly to exist as a geographic fact rather than a chosen destination. The deputies were 2 men named Hollis and Rourke, both competent and straightforward, in the way of men who have been doing serious work for long enough that it has stripped them of pretension. They received Mamie with the respectful professionalism of men who had been briefed by their superior that she was a material witness of importance, and were smart enough to understand what that meant. The plan was laid out that evening in the back room of Vega's single saloon, over a table with a map of the Panhandle spread across it and 4 cups of coffee that were at least hot. Finch's ranch property was accessible from 2 directions. The plan was a coordinated arrival from both, at first light, with Clement and Mamie taking the south approach, Hollis and Rourke the north. They had reasonable intelligence that Finch was present. They had warrants, proper federal ones, for his arrest on charges that included trafficking, conspiracy, fraud, and several additional counts that Hollis had summarized with a kind of grim satisfaction. "If he runs," Clement said, "we contain. We do not take unnecessary risks." "What about his men?" Rourke asked. "Finch is careful. He does not keep many people close. 3 or 4 at the ranch, according to our information. We will be 5. He looked at Mamie. "You have a firearm." "A revolver," she said. "A Colt. I can use it." Hollis and Rourke exchanged a glance that she chose to interpret as impressed rather than skeptical. "You stay with me," Clement said to her. "Not because you cannot handle yourself. Because you are the one Finch wants to silence, and I need to know where you are." "Agreed," she said. They left before dawn and arrived at the Finch property as the sky was beginning to differentiate itself from the land in the particular slow gray way of Panhandle mornings. The ranch was a working operation with enough surface legitimacy to have kept suspicion at bay. A main house, a bunkhouse, corrals, a barn. A windmill turned slowly in the early morning air. What followed was not the violent confrontation of the dime novels, which Mamie had read and found largely ridiculous. It was careful and quick and mostly bloodless, the professional execution of a plan by people who had thought it through. Hollis and Rourke came in from the north while Clement and Mamie held the south, and Finch was found in the main house in the process of eating breakfast, which she thought was exactly the right location for him to be apprehended, engaged in the mundane, ordinary business of his day while the consequences of his actions arrived at his door. He was a smaller man than she remembered. She had built him into something enormous in her memory, the way you build the things that have hurt you, and seeing him actually be a person of ordinary dimensions was both satisfying and strange. He was in his 50s, gray-haired and florid, dressed well as he always had been, and when he saw Mamie behind Clement in the doorway, something moved across his face that she recognized with cold clarity as the calculation of a man looking for an angle. "I don't know what she's told you," Finch began. "Enough," Clement said. "Harold Finch, I am placing you under arrest on federal charges. You have the right to present yourself to legal counsel." What followed was several hours of the procedural reality of an arrest in 1878, which was not romantic and involved a great deal of paperwork, and the management of 3 ranch hands who were sullen but not suicidal about the presence of federal authority. Finch was secured and made ready for transport, and throughout all of it Mamie stood and watched with a steadiness that she had not known for certain she would have until she actually felt it in her body. A kind of resolution, not the hysterical triumph of revenge, but something quieter and more lasting. Clement came to stand beside her, while Hollis and Rourke managed the logistics of departure. He did not say anything immediately. He stood with her in the morning light of the Panhandle, and the windmill turned and the sky continued its slow transformation toward full day. "How are you?" he said. "I think I am all right," she said. "Better than I expected. I expected more." She searched for the word drama. "Reality is often less dramatic than we anticipate," he said. "The drama was in the preparation." She nodded. "Then, will it hold the case against him?" "I believe so," he said. "We have your testimony and the statements of 9 other women, and a ledger we found in the house that is even more detailed than you described. Federal court, with a federal judge appointed from outside this territory, not someone Finch can buy." He paused. "It will take time. Courts take time, but yes, I believe it will hold." She exhaled. "I want to thank you," she said, turning to look at him, and the morning light was doing something very honest to his face, showing exactly what was there, which was the face of a man who was tired and resolute and looking at her with an expression that was not professional concern alone. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I know I do not need to," she said. "I want to." There was a moment between them that was different from the other moments, weighted with something that both of them had been carefully not naming for 2 weeks. She was aware of how close they were standing, aware of the particular quality of his attention, which had always been thorough and was now something more than that. "Mamie," he said, and the way he said her name had changed too, had dropped the careful formality of a man being professional. "Yes," she said. "I am going to need to transport Finch to Amarillo, and then eventually to the federal court in San Antonio," he said. "That process will take some weeks. And I find myself," he paused, and that thumb went along his jaw, "very much hoping that when it is concluded you might still be in Laredo." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why Laredo specifically?" she said. "Because that is where I live," he said simply. "And if I were in Laredo," she said carefully, "what would that allow for?" "Whatever you chose to allow for," he said with a directness that she respected enormously. "I have no right to ask you for anything. What I have is the specific and rather persistent feeling that I would like very much to continue talking to you for the foreseeable future." "Just talking," she said. Something shifted in his eyes, a warmth that he was no longer bothering to keep entirely contained. "I am trying to be respectful," he said. "You are being respectful," she said. "I am asking you to be honest." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "No, not just talking." Mamie Ford looked at this man in the Panhandle morning, this careful, honest, quietly determined man who had spent 4 years trying to build justice for people the world largely ignored, who had listened to her without condescension and fought alongside her without claiming ownership of the fight. And she thought that she had been alone for a very long time, and that loneliness was a kind of weather that changed a person, and that she was perhaps ready for different weather. "I will be in Laredo," she said. "When you are done." He looked at her with those gray eyes and a slow, genuine smile that rearranged his face into something she realized she wanted to look at for a considerable amount of time. "Good," he said. The weeks that followed were long in the way of separations that mean something. Clement went north with Finch and the San Antonio deputies, and Mamie returned to Laredo, back to Mrs. Reyes's boarding house, which received her with the warmth of a place that has decided to be home, at least for now. She was not idle. She wrote. She had always written well, her father's daughter in this as in other things, and now she wrote with purpose, setting down the full account of what Finch had done and what she had done to stop it, a document that was part legal testimony and part something else, a record of the women whose names deserved to be spoken. She shared it with the editor of the local newspaper, a man named Thomas Archer, who was earnest and young and genuinely appalled by what she told him, and who published a careful version of it that sent ripples through the community in ways she was still seeing weeks later. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that Laredo suited her. It was a border town, which meant it was complicated in ways she found more honest than the artificial simplicities of places that pretended everyone within them was the same. The population was mixed, Anglo and Mexican and mestizo, with the social hierarchies and injustices that complexity always contained, but also with a texture and richness that she responded to. She learned more Spanish from Mrs. Reyes. She began helping out at a small school that was run out of a church on the edge of town, where the teacher was overwhelmed and grateful for assistance in the afternoons. She thought about Clement. She thought about him with a regularity that she accepted without fighting, because she had spent 3 years fighting everything, and she was beginning to understand that not all things required a battle. He wrote to her. The letters were practical on the surface, updating her on the progress of the case, the status of the court proceedings being arranged for Finch, the additional warrants that the evidence had enabled for 2 of Finch's associates. But underneath the practical content was a texture that was not practical at all. Details included because he thought she would find them interesting, observations about the places he was traveling through, a dry humor that emerged in his writing more readily than it did in his speech. And at the end of each letter, a line or two that were not about the case at all. In the third letter, he wrote, "I have been thinking about the morning at the ranch, and the way the light came in from the east, and the way you look standing in it, and I find I am not particularly inclined to stop thinking about it, which I consider to be useful information about myself." She read that letter 4 times. She wrote back. She was not a coy woman and had no interest in pretending otherwise. She wrote to him about the school and about Mrs. Ray's and about the newspaper article and about Dolars, who was thriving at the Laredo livery and had developed an apparently committed friendship with a bay gelding in the adjacent stall. She wrote about what Laredo looked like in the spring evenings when the light came off the Rio Grande. And at the end of the letter she wrote, "I find myself thinking about you more than is strictly necessary for the purposes of a professional acquaintance, which I suspect is also useful information." His reply to that particular line arrived faster than the previous letters had, which she took as meaningful data. The case against Harold Finch went to federal court in San Antonio in the early summer of 1878. Mamie traveled there by stage to provide her testimony in person, which she had insisted on from the beginning, and which Clement had not tried to talk her out of. She wore the best dress she had been able to acquire in the interim, a dark blue wool that she had purchased from a dressmaker in Laredo with some of the money she had earned through her work at the school, and she sat in the witness stand in the federal courtroom and told the truth in a clear, steady voice, while the defense attorney did his best and did not succeed. Clement was there for every day of the trial. He sat at the prosecution table as the arresting marshal, and he watched her testify with those gray eyes that she could feel on her from across the room, steady and warm and something more than professional. When the judge called a recess, she would find him in the hallway, and they would stand together and he would ask how she was doing, and she would tell him honestly, and he would listen, and the particular quality of that listening had become one of the things she valued most in the world. The verdict came on the third day, guilty on all primary counts. Harold Finch was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, and the judge's statement from the bench was a thorough condemnation of the trafficking network and the failure of local law enforcement to address it, which Mamie had not expected, and which she felt in her chest like something unlocking. She sat in the courtroom gallery as the verdict was read and the sentence pronounced, and she was very still, and she thought of the women she had interviewed, the women whose names were in her written account, and she thought of Ruth Caldwell, who had helped her escape and who was currently, according to Mamie's last letter to her, working as a seamstress in Wichita and doing adequately. And she thought of the woman Clement had told her about, Margaret Holloway, 26 years old. And she thought of all the unnamed ones, the ones too afraid or too far away or no longer living to have their names in anyone's record. It was not enough. It was never entirely enough. But it was something real, something that had happened in the world and could not be unhappened. She became aware of Clement settling into the seat beside her. The courtroom was emptying around them, voices and footsteps and the shuffling of papers, and he sat next to her in the diminishing crowd and said nothing, just was there, which was exactly what was needed. After a while she said, "He is going to prison for 12 years. "Yes," Clement said. "It should be longer," she said. "Yes," he said. "It should be. The law has a long way to go." "But today it did something," she said. "Today it did something," he agreed. She turned to look at him, and they were very close in the quiet of the emptying courtroom, and she could see all of what was in his face, the tiredness and the satisfaction and the thing that had been there since the porch of his house in the hills when the last light was going out of the western sky, the thing neither of them had said plainly yet. "Clement," she said. "Mamie," he said. "I would like very much," she said carefully, "to go home." "To Laredo," he said. "I think so," she said. "I think Laredo might be home." "I was hoping you would say that," he said, and the smile was there again, the one that rearranged his face and made her feel warm all the way to her fingertips. They traveled back to Laredo together, side by side on the stage, and the Texas landscape rolled past the windows, and they talked and were sometimes quiet, and the quiet was as good as the talking, which was, Mamie had always believed, the actual test of compatibility. She told him about her father, the whole of it this time, the schoolteacher who had believed fiercely in the potential of his daughters and had given them Latin and mathematics, and told them that the world would not always agree with him about their value, but that they should not let the world make that determination for them. Clement listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and when she was done he said, "He sounds like someone worth being the daughter of." "He was," she said. "I miss him every day." "I know," he said. "My brother was the same. I think we carry the people who loved us well. They become part of the structure." She thought about that for a long time. In Laredo, they returned to the rhythm of the place, but the rhythm had changed, because things between them had shifted into something that was no longer being carefully unnamed. He came for dinner at Mrs. Ray's boarding house, and Mrs. Ray's cooked with the enthusiasm of someone who has been planning this development for some time, and is not even slightly trying to conceal her satisfaction about it. He took Mamie riding on Sunday mornings, the two of them out into the hill country east of town, Dolars and his dark bay horse moving at an easy pace through the cedar and the limestone, and they talked about everything and nothing, and the hills were beautiful in the summer light. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in the small courtyard behind Mrs. Ray's boarding house, where the fig tree grew, because he had walked her home after dinner at the hotel, and they had stopped in the courtyard for reasons that were not entirely clear to either of them. And he had looked at her in the moonlight with an expression that she had been reading long enough to read correctly, and she had said, "Well then," which she recognized was not the most romantic sentence ever spoken, but which made him laugh that surprised laugh, and then he kissed her. And it was nothing like the world she had been living in for 3 years, and everything like the world she intended to build from here. "I've been meaning to do that," he said against her hair after, "for approximately 6 weeks. "I know," she said. "I had noticed." "And yet you said nothing," he said. "I was waiting to see how long it would take you," she said, "for research purposes." He laughed again and held her closer, and the fig tree moved in the soft evening wind, and the Laredo night went on around them in its lively, multilingual way, and Mamie Ford thought that she was, with some reasonable certainty, going to be all right. The summer moved forward with the particular beauty of things that are both expected and still surprising when they arrive. They spent their evenings together and their mornings separately, and met in between for the business of their lives, which were increasingly intertwined. She continued at the school, and the teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Briggs, asked if she would consider taking on a formal position in the fall, and Mamie said she would think about it, meaning yes, and told Clement about it over supper, and he said, with a sincerity that settled into her like warmth, that he thought she would be extraordinary at it. He was, she had discovered, a man with very specific domestic habits that were entirely compatible with her own, which she took as a good sign from the universe. He was neat without being rigid. He cooked adequately and did not make a performance of the fact that he found it less interesting than she did. He had strong opinions about the proper care of horses and somewhat less strong opinions about most other practical matters, which meant there was room for her opinions, which were comprehensive. He had a quality she valued enormously, which was that when he was wrong about something and she told him so with evidence, he acknowledged it without ceremony and changed his position, rather than defending the original stance out of stubbornness or wounded pride. They had arguments because they were both people of strong conviction and the world gave them things to argue about. They argued about the right approach to a political situation in the county that Clement felt required patience, and Mamie felt required faster action. They argued about a novel she had borrowed from his bookshelf and found adequate while he considered it exceptional. They argued occasionally about where to eat supper. The arguments were always resolved by the end of the day, which was a rule Mamie established early and Clement accepted without argument, which she found ironic and told him so. In August, he took her back to the limestone house in the hills for a weekend, the first time she had been back since the spring. The property looked different in the summer, the garden more overgrown, the cedar along the north fence dense and dark, but the porch still faced east and the view was still exactly what it had been. And she stood in the yard in the morning with coffee in her hands and felt the permanence of the place, its willingness to simply be what it was. She turned to find him watching her from the porch. "You love this place," she said. "I do," he said. "I have been thinking about doing more with it. The house could use significant work. The kitchen garden needs attention." He paused, looking at her with a directness that was different from his usual directness in a way she was beginning to identify. "I have been thinking about whether it might be the kind of place someone else might want to be." She set her coffee down on the porch railing and looked at him. "Are you asking me a question?" she said. "I am working my way toward one," he said. "Work faster," she said, and he smiled and set down his own coffee and came down the porch steps to where she was standing in the yard, and he took both her hands in his, which were warm and rough-palmed and entirely steady, and he said, "Mamie Ford, I would like very much to marry you if you are willing. I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met. I think you are brave and sharp and kind and honest, and I would like to spend as much time as possible in the same location as you for the rest of my life, and I recognize that is a lot to ask of someone, but I am asking." Mamie looked at him in the August morning, this man who had listened and believed and fought alongside her and kissed her in the fig tree courtyard, and made her laugh more than she had laughed in years. And she thought about the girl she had been who had planned to be a teacher, and the woman she had become who had crossed 3 territories and built a legal case from nothing, and the woman she was now standing in a limestone yard in the Texas Hill Country with her hands in the hands of a man who was asking for her whole future. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He looked at her for a moment as if making sure she was real, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her there in the morning light with the hills going green and gold around them, and the cedar moving in the south wind. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the deep, unguarded ease of being somewhere she was supposed to be. They were married in October of 1878 in the courtyard of Mrs. Ray's boarding house, which was decorated with the last of the summer flowers and paper lanterns that Mrs. Ray's had been making in secret for several weeks. The ceremony was performed by a minister who came from the local church and who did not rush through the words, because Clement had asked him specifically not to, that he wanted to hear every word said properly. Mamie wore a dress of ivory cotton that Mrs. Ray's and 2 of her friends had made, and she carried a small bouquet of autumn wildflowers, and she stood across from Clement Wells in the soft October light and made her promises in a voice that did not shake, because she was not afraid of these promises, was absolutely certain of them in the way she had been certain of very few things in her life, but certain of these. Clement made his promises in his careful, unhurried voice, looking directly at her with those gray eyes, and when the minister pronounced them married and he kissed her there in the courtyard with their small gathering of witnesses applauding, Mrs. Ray's crying openly and not apologizing for it, the deputies Hollies and Rourke who had ridden down from San Antonio for the occasion, Miss Briggs from the school, and several other people who had become the texture of Laredo to Mamie in the months she had lived there. She felt the day as something complete, a thing with clear edges before and after. They moved to the limestone house in the hills, though Mamie kept her work at the school, riding into Laredo 3 days a week on dolars while Clement managed his cases from a combination of the Laredo office and the property itself. The house, which received the attention Clement had been planning, became something real under their combined effort. He was good with structure and she was good with everything else, and by the winter it was warm and solid and full of the small accumulated details of a life being built deliberately. She became the formal teacher's assistant at the school in the fall, and Miss Briggs, who was bright and principled and became a genuine friend, used her increasingly not as an assistant but as an equal partner in the work, so that by the following year it was simply known to the children and their families that there were two teachers, and the school was better for it. Clement continued his work, and the nature of his work remained what it was, which meant it was sometimes dangerous and always demanding. And they had one conversation early in the winter where she told him plainly that she understood what his work was, and did not intend to ask him to diminish it, but that she also intended to know the truth of his situations at all times, and that half-truths in the interest of protecting her feelings were not a currency she would accept. He agreed to this with the ease of a man who had never been particularly inclined to half-truths in any case. The first real test of it came in February of 1879, when he rode out to pursue a wanted man across the Panhandle, and did not come back on the day he had expected to. And she spent 48 hours managing fear with the specific combination of work, practicality, and controlled breathing she had developed over years of practice. And when he came through the door on the third day, muddy and tired, and with a prisoner in tow for Hollies to collect, she held him for a long time without saying anything, and then made him sit down and eat while she told him about what the children had been working on at the school. He said afterward that that particular combination of response was more than he had deserved. She said that she knew that and that he should try to remember it. He laughed. In the spring of 1879, Mamie discovered she was pregnant. She told Clement on a Sunday morning when they were sitting on the porch with their coffee, and the hills were green from the winter rains, and she watched his face move through surprise to something that was entirely unguarded, a joy so direct and uncomplicated that it was like watching a man discover something he had not known he had been hoping for. He set down his coffee cup and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and then he said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" "I feel entirely well," she said. "I am told the tiredness is normal." "You are tired," he said immediately. "Not right now," she said. "Clement." "Yes. I am very happy," she said. He exhaled and the smile came, and he said, "I am very happy too." "I am also," he paused. "I am also quite aware that I am going to worry, and I would ask your permission to worry reasonably without you telling me it is unnecessary." "Agreed," she said, "on the condition that you express the worry productively rather than hovering." "What does productive worry look like?" "You could fix the fence on the south side of the garden," she said. "It has needed attention since November." The fence was fixed within the week. The pregnancy was, in the main, uneventful in the best possible sense. She continued teaching through the summer, slowing down somewhat in the final months when the heat and her expanding body made the 3 times weekly ride into Laredo inadvisable, and she taught from home instead, Miss Briggs bringing her work, and they met twice a week on the porch of the limestone house to plan and review. In November of 1879, a boy was born. Clement had fetched Mrs. Reyes and the Laredo midwife, a calm and experienced woman named Doña Carmen, who had been delivering babies in the region for 30 years, and whose presence in the room was as reassuring as a clear sky. It was a long day, as first births tend to be, and Clement, who had been asked to remain in the kitchen on the grounds that his anxiety was taking up too much of the room, paced so consistently that Mamie could hear his footsteps from behind the bedroom door and found them, inexplicably, comforting. When Doña Carmen opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room in 3 steps and stood over the bed where Mamie was propped against the pillows holding a small red-faced creature wrapped in the blanket Mrs. Reyes had been knitting for months, and his face did the thing it did when he was feeling something large, went very still, and then very open in a sequence she had learned to read. "Hello," he said softly to the baby. The baby, who was called Samuel James Wells after a brother and a father, made no intelligible response but appeared to consider his options. "He looks like you," Clement said to Mamie. "He looks like a baby," she said, "which is correct because he is one. but she was smiling and her voice was full of the particular softness of that hour, and Clement sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife and then back at his son, and the November light came through the east window, and the cedar moved on the north fence, and the limestone house held them in its solid quiet. "Thank you," he said to her. "You helped," she said. "Some months ago," he agreed, and she laughed, tired and happy and entirely herself. Samuel was a good-natured baby who became a curious and energetic child, and the limestone house expanded to contain him in the way that houses accommodate children, with noise and color and small boots by the door, and discoveries brought in from the yard at regular intervals for examination. Clement was the kind of father who came home from his work and immediately went to wherever the child was, the kind who sat on the ground and built things and explained things with patient thoroughness, and Mamie watched him with their son, and felt a gratitude that was so large and so present it was sometimes difficult to locate its edges. She continued to teach. When Samuel was old enough to travel, she brought him with her on the Laredo days, and he sat at the back of the schoolroom with notable concentration for a child his age, and the older students took turns looking after him with the serious pride of children given genuine responsibility. In the spring of 1882, when Samuel was 2.5, Mamie found that she was pregnant again. She told Clement in the same place she had told him the first time, on the porch in the morning, and his response was similarly uncomplicated joy, followed by the same request to worry productively, which she granted on the same fence-related conditions, at which point he pointed out that there were no more fences in need of fixing. "Then you can build new ones," she said. He built a proper chicken coop, which they had been discussing for some time, and a storage shed behind the kitchen garden, and expanded the garden itself. The fence along the east side of the property was also reinforced, on the grounds that it had looked as though it might need it eventually. In October of 1882, a daughter was born. They named her Clara, after Mamie's sister, and she arrived in the world with a velocity and volume of expression that suggested strong opinions from the outset. Clara Wells was a child who knew what she wanted, who was fearless in the specific way of people who have not yet accumulated reasons to be afraid, and who regarded the world and everyone in it as a source of interesting information. Mamie wrote to her sister regularly, had done since returning to Laredo, and Clara's birth was the occasion for a proper visit. Clara Ford, now Clara Harmon, arrived from the Panhandle with her husband and their 3 children in the following spring, and the limestone house was full for 2 weeks in the best possible way, loud with children and conversation, and the kind of laughter that belongs to people who share history. Clara looked at Clement with the evaluating eye of an older sister who has been receiving letters about this person for years and has her own assessment to make, and then she looked at Mamie, and then she said, quiet enough that only Mamie heard it, "He is good." "Yes," Mamie said, "he listens to you. He does." "Good," Clara said. "Father would have approved." Mamie pressed her sister's hand and did not need to say anything else. The years that followed were the years of a life genuinely lived, which meant they were neither uniformly easy nor uniformly peaceful, but were full of the specific texture and color that comes from people who have committed to the work of building something together. Clement continued his federal work through the early 1880s, and the nature of that work evolved as the territory did, the wild and lawless character of the West diminishing steadily as railroads came and population grew, and the particular frontier that had defined the region gave way to something more settled. There were losses along the way, cases that didn't hold, fugitives who got away, the steady accumulation of the imperfections of justice that Clement had always understood would be part of the work. There were also victories, some of them significant. A trafficking network in New Mexico dismantled with the help of contacts Mamie had made during her original investigation. A warrant that Clement served in the Panhandle that resulted in the arrest of one of Finch's former associates, who had continued the operation on a smaller scale after Finch's imprisonment. The law was imperfect, but it was not static, and the people who worked within it with genuine commitment pushed it forward. Harold Finch remained in federal prison. The 12-year sentence held. Mamie knew this because she kept track, not out of obsession, but out of the simple conviction that one should know where threats are. She had written a full account of the Finch case and the network he had operated, and with Clement's support and the help of Thomas Archer, the Laredo newspaper editor, she had seen it published in a form that was read beyond the local community, that made its way into the hands of federal legislators who were beginning, slowly and insufficiently but genuinely, to reckon with the problem. She did not expect to change the world overnight. She expected to change specific pieces of it through specific sustained effort, which she had found was how lasting change actually happened. The school grew. What had started as an overcrowded church room became a proper schoolhouse built by the community in 1883, and Mamie was part of the reason for that. Her combination of persistent advocacy and the reputation she had built as someone whose word could be trusted on matters of education and justice. The new school had 2 classrooms and 2 full teachers, and Mamie had one of the positions, which she held with the complete devotion of someone who has found their purpose. She loved the children. She loved their directness and their curiosity and the particular pleasure of watching understanding arrive in someone's face, the moment when a concept that had been abstract became real and useful. She taught reading and writing and mathematics and history, and she taught them with the conviction her father had given her that knowing things was the best defense against a world that would sometimes try to reduce you. That language and mathematics and the record of what had happened in the world were tools that belonged to everyone and that no one should be prevented from having. Samuel started school the year the new building opened, walking into his mother's classroom with the particular combination of excitement and careful dignity of a child who has been hearing about something for a long time and is finally encountering it. He was a good student, precise and curious like his father, and he took to reading the way some children take to horses, with an immediate and obvious rightness. Clara, 3 years behind him, entered school with the forward momentum of someone who has been watching the gate and is finally through it. And she was a different kind of student, wide-ranging and interested in everything simultaneously, difficult to contain within a single subject, which Mamie recognized as a different kind of brightness and treated accordingly. On an evening in the fall of 1885, when Samuel was almost 6 and Clara was almost 3, Mamie stood in the doorway of the limestone house in the last light of the day and looked at the hills. They were amber and rose in the setting sun, the cedar along the north fence dark and full, the garden putting itself to bed for the winter in the reliable way of things that know their cycles. Behind her in the house, she could hear Clement reading to Samuel, his voice unhurried and engaged with the story, and Clara had gone to sleep an hour ago in the reliable fashion of a child who runs until she stops. It was ordinary. It was completely, wonderfully ordinary. She heard Clement's voice pause and then his footsteps, and then he was behind her in the doorway, and he put one arm around her from behind, warm and solid and without ceremony. "What are you looking at?" he said softly. "The hills," she said. "The light. It is good light tonight," he said. "Yes," she said. She leaned back against him and he held her, and the hills went from amber to rose to the first deep blue of evening, and a coyote called somewhere far off in the cedar, and the October air was sharp and clear and full of cedar and limestone and the particular smell of the Texas hill country that she had come to love in the specific way you love a place that has been good to you. "Clement," she said. "Yes." "I am very glad I walked into that office," she said. He was quiet for a moment and she could feel the smile in him even without seeing it. "So am I," he said, "more than I have words for." She turned around to face him, there in the doorway of their house in the last light of the day, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 7 years, the gray eyes and the jaw and the face she had memorized without intending to and would know for the rest of her life, and she said, I think Sam needs more Latin. He blinked. Right now. Eventually, she said, and he laughed and she laughed. And inside the house Samuel called from his bed asking for one more story, and Clara made the small sounds of a sleeping child shifting in her sleep. And the night came on over the Texas hills, and the limestone house held its light against the dark the way it always had, solid and warm and entirely sufficient, and the two of them stood in the doorway of everything they had built together. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was theirs. In the year that followed, Mamie began writing in earnest, not just the accounts of legal cases or the testimony she had given, but something longer and more complete, the full story of what had happened to her and what she had done about it, and what the women whose names she had collected had survived, and what they deserved to have said on their behalf. She wrote it in the evenings when the children were in bed, at the small writing desk that Clement had built for her and placed in the corner of the main room where the lamplight fell best. And she wrote with the discipline and care of someone who understands that certain things need to be said precisely or not at all. Clement read every page as she wrote it, quietly and without comment until she asked for comment, and when she did he gave it honestly, which was useful, and he told her every time that what she was writing mattered, which was necessary in the way that certain things are necessary regardless of whether we think we need them. She sent the completed manuscript to a publisher in New York in the spring of 1886, accompanied by a letter that was the distillation of everything she had learned about making herself heard, clear and direct and unapologetic. And she waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting does not mean passive, but that some things move at the speed they move and cannot be hurried into a different pace. The reply came in August. The publisher wanted the manuscript, with some revisions to the middle section that Mamie looked at carefully and agreed were valid, and the book would be published the following year. She held the letter in her hands at the kitchen table and read it twice, and then set it down and went to find Clement. He was in the garden, which had become genuinely productive under their sustained attention, staking the last of the summer tomatoes against the wind that had come up from the south. He looked up when she came through the kitchen door and saw her face and stopped what he was doing. "Tell me," he said. "They want the book," she said. He covered the distance between them in several steps and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that held everything, the years of her work on it, the years before that, the women who needed their names in a published record, the sheer fact of her extraordinary persistence, and he said, "Of course they do. Of course they do." She let him hold her there in the kitchen garden in the August heat, and she thought of her father telling her that the world would not always agree with him about her value, but that she should not let the world make that determination for her. And she thought that she had managed that, not because she had been fearless, because she had not been fearless, but because she had found that the alternative to fear was not fearlessness, but rather the stubborn, daily decision to move forward anyway. And that this was something you could teach yourself and teach other people and teach children, who would then take it forward into a world that still needed it badly. "Clement," she said. "Yes," he said, his chin on top of her head in the way he had. "I would like to have another child," she said, "if you are willing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, the surprised laugh she loved, the one that caught him off guard. "Where does that come from?" "I have been thinking about it," she said. "The book is done. The school is going well. Sam and Clara are old enough, and I would like more." She pulled back enough to look at him. "Is that too much?" He looked at her, this woman who had walked into his office with a piece of paper and 4 years' worth of his work in her hands and her own 3 years of survival and determination, and the absolute refusal to be less than she was, and he said, "Nothing you want is too much." The third child, another son they named Henry after no one in particular, but because the name suited him, arrived in the spring of 1887, the same spring the book was published. He was a placid baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's careful attention, and he arrived into a household that was ready for him in the way of families that have learned their own rhythms. The book was published under the title that Mamie had given it, which was also the name of the first chapter, which was also the thing she had understood more clearly than almost anything else from the experience of the last decade. It was reviewed in 3 newspapers, including one in San Antonio and one in New York, and the reviews were serious and respectful, and said what she had hoped they would say, that this was an account of real events that deserved to be part of the record. Letters came from women who recognized their own experiences in what she had written, from officials who said they were using the account in their work, from strangers who simply wanted to say that they had read it and it had mattered to them. She read each one and answered when she could, and she kept them in a wooden box that Clement had made, dovetailed at the corners and smooth finished, the kind of thing built to last. She stood at the front of her classroom in Laredo on a morning in October of 1887. With the autumn light coming through the windows she had argued 3 years ago with the school board to have enlarged, because children needed proper light to learn by, and she looked at the faces of her students, 18 children between the ages of 6 and 14, different in every way that children in a border town were different, and she understood. With the particular clarity of a moment that contains the whole of what has come before it, that she had made something of her life, not in spite of what had happened to her, not as a negation of it, but through it and with it, and because of it, the way rivers run through canyons and make something that could not exist without the cutting. She went home that evening on Dolors, who was gray-muzzled now and slower but still Dolors, still moving forward with that particular steadiness, and the hill country road was familiar under the mare's feet, and the hills in the evening light were the same hills they had always been, and the limestone house at the end of the road had its lights on already because Clement was home, and had the lamp burning, the way he always had the lamp burning when he got home before her. A small thing she had never once taken for granted. She put Dolors in the paddock and came through the kitchen door to the sound of the house in the evening, Henry fussing mildly in the way of the almost 6-month-old he was, Samuel's voice in the next room reading aloud to his younger sister, who loudly disputed his interpretations of the story at regular intervals, the smell of something on the stove that Clement had started. He turned from the stove when she came in and said, "How were they today?" Maria Vasquez finally understood long division, she said, hanging up her coat. You should have seen her face. Tell me, he said, and he was already handing her Henry, who settled against her shoulder with the boneless contentment of a fed baby, and they stood in the kitchen of the limestone house, while she told him about Maria Vasquez and long division, and the particular expression of a child who has understood something for the first time, and he listened the way he always listened. And the stove kept the kitchen warm, and the hill country evening came down outside the windows. And Samuel's reading voice and Clara's commentary continued in the next room like the ongoing narrative of their own small world. Harold Finch served his 12 years and was released in 1890, and Mamie knew this because she had kept track. She knew also, through Clement's connections in the federal system, that Finch was an old and diminished man by then, his money largely gone through legal fees and the mismanagement of a man who had lost his infrastructure, and that he had returned to a cousin's property in East Texas, where he lived in obscurity, and without the means or apparent inclination to rebuild what had been destroyed. She considered this information carefully and for some time, and then she filed it in the part of her mind that held things that were finished, and she turned back to the life she was living. Henry Wells started school in 1892, walking into his mother's classroom with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for this his entire cognitive life, and Mamie received him with the same impartial welcome she gave every student, because she had learned long ago that her children needed to know she was their teacher in the schoolroom and their mother everywhere else, and that the distinction was one of context rather than affection. Clara by then was 10 and brilliant and difficult and magnificent in the way of children who are always going to be too large for any single room they are placed in, and Mamie looked at her daughter sometimes and thought of herself at 10, before the losses, before the hard years, and thought that the best thing she could do for Clara was to give her all the knowledge and capability she could carry, and then trust her with it, which she fully intended to do. Samuel at 12 was already talking about law, having grown up with the law as a presence in the household, and having absorbed from his father a serious interest in how it worked, and from his mother an equally serious interest in how it failed and what could be done about that. Clement did not push him toward anything, but Mamie could see the satisfaction in him when Samuel asked good questions about a case he was working, and she thought that there were worse things than a family that built in the same direction. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1893, when Henry was 6 and Clara was 10 and Samuel was 12 and Mamie was 39 and Clement was 45, they sat on the porch of the limestone house in the early light and drank their coffee in the way they had drunk their coffee on Sunday mornings for 15 years. And the hills were green from the spring rains, and the cedar was full and dark along the north fence, and the kitchen garden was coming back to life in the reliable way of things that have good roots. "Are you happy?" Clement asked. It was the kind of question that sounded simple and was not. She looked at the hills and at the cedar and at the kitchen garden, and she thought about Maria Vasquez and long division, and the box of letters in her study, and the book on the shelf in 3 libraries she had visited, and the women whose names she had collected, and the 12 years Harold Finch had spent in a federal prison, and the verdict read in a San Antonio courtroom that she had sat through with Clement's gray eyes steady on her across the room. She thought about Dolers, who had died peacefully the previous winter and been buried in the corner of the property where the live oak grew, and about Mrs. Reyes, who was still in Laredo and still running the boarding house and was coming to dinner on Thursday. She thought about her father and about Samuel the brother and about Clara her sister, living now in Waco with her husband and grandchildren that Mamie visited in the summers. She thought about the girl she had been, and the woman she had become, and the road that connected them, which was not straight but which had led here. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand for 15 years, without ceremony or performance, simply because she was there and her hand was there, and this was what you did with the person who was your life. "Good," he said. The coffee was warm and the hills were green, and the children would be up soon with their noise and their needs and their extraordinary ordinary presences, and the morning would continue in the way of mornings that have the very great good fortune of being someone's life. And Mamie Ford Wells sat on the porch of her limestone house in the Texas Hill Country in the spring of 1893, and knew exactly where she was, which was home, which was the only thing that had ever truly mattered, and which she had built herself, one determined step at a time, from the wreckage of everything that had tried to stop her. The light came over the eastern hills and fell warm and golden across the porch and across the two of them sitting in it, and the cedar moved on the north fence, and the morning went on.